The docking bay alarm screamed before I even reached my cargo hauler, and I knew something was wrong. My name is Claire Bennett, and I have spent the last 6 years hauling freight across the outer rim stations, doing work no one else wanted, so I could keep my small apartment and my even smaller savings account. Station Kestrel 9 was not a friendly place. It belonged, in every way that mattered, to the Vasari Combine, an alien organization that ran the shipping lanes, the water rations, and the lives of every human who lived there. I ran across the platform, dodging a maintenance drone, and skidded to a stop in front of my ship. The cargo doors were open. My entire shipment, 3 months of saved credits worth of medical supplies, was gone. Looking for something? I turned around slowly. Damon Voss stood there, arms crossed, flanked by 2 Vasari enforcers who towered over him like living statues. Damon was human, or mostly human, though rumors said his mother had struck a deal with the Combine before he was born that changed him in ways no one talked about openly. He ran every illegal transport route through this sector. Everyone called him the boss, and not because they respected him, because they were afraid. "You took my cargo," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "I redirected it," he said, like that explained anything. "You'll be compensated. More than compensated, actually. I don't want compensation. I want my shipment back. People are waiting on those supplies." He studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that made most people on this station lower their eyes and apologize for existing. I didn't look away. "You have nerve," he said. "I like that. Walk with me." I didn't move. "I have a shipment to deliver." "The shipment isn't going anywhere you think it is," he said. "Not anymore. Walk with me, Claire, and I'll explain everything. Or don't, and lose everything you've built here in the next 10 minutes. Your choice." I hated that he knew my name. I hated more that I didn't have a choice at all. We walked through a maintenance corridor that led toward the upper ring of the station, where the air recyclers actually worked and the lighting wasn't flickering every few seconds. Damon didn't say much until we reached a private lounge that overlooked the docking bays below, human ships and Vasari cruisers, moving in the black distance like slow insects. "I have a proposal," he said, finally, pouring himself a drink he didn't offer me. 1 billion credits. Transferred to an account in your name within the hour. I laughed, actually laughed, because it was such an absurd number that my brain refused to take it seriously. "For what?" "Marriage," he said. "To me. On paper only, if that makes it easier to swallow. The Combine has new regulations coming for anyone running unlicensed transport through this sector. A legal human spouse changes my classification under their law. It protects my operations. It protects the people who work for me, including, eventually, you. You want to marry me to avoid alien tax law?" "I want to marry you to survive it," he said. "There's a difference." I stared at him, waiting for the part where he laughed and told me it was some kind of test, some kind of joke, designed to see how I'd react under pressure. That part never came. He was serious. Dead serious, with 1 billion credits sitting in some transfer queue waiting for my answer. "No," I said. He blinked, like the word genuinely surprised him. "No? No, I'm not for sale, and I'm not going to be part of whatever scheme keeps your operation running smoothly with the Combine. Find someone else. There is no one else who fits the requirements as cleanly as you do." "Then you have a problem," I said, because my answer is still no. I turned and walked out of that lounge with my heart pounding so hard I thought the enforcers behind me could hear it. Nobody said no to Damon Voss, nobody. I had heard the stories, the way people who crossed him simply stopped showing up to work, stopped answering messages, sometimes stopped existing on the station registry altogether. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself principles mattered more than fear. I got back to my apartment that night expecting trouble, expecting a warning message, expecting anything except silence. Instead, nothing happened. No threats. No visit. Just quiet. That quiet should have scared me more than anything else. The next morning, I woke up to my apartment door not recognizing my access chip. I stood in the corridor in my sleep clothes, badge in hand, watching the little red light blink "no match found" over and over again, while my neighbor across the hall peeked out to see what the noise was about. "Claire?" she said. "Is everything okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly, because I genuinely didn't. I went down to the station's residential office, where a tired-looking clerk named Nathan Pierce scrolled through records on a screen that seemed to load slower with every passing second. According to this, Nathan said slowly, frowning at the display, you don't live there anymore. Your unit was reassigned last night. Transfer approved and processed under Combine Housing Authority. By who? He turned the screen toward me, and there it was, plain as anything. A transfer order, signed off under a corporate designation I recognized instantly. Voss Logistics Group. I felt the floor tilt slightly under my feet, even though nothing physical had moved at all. There has to be a mistake, I said. I'm not seeing a mistake, Nathan said carefully. I'm seeing a very clean, very legal transfer. Someone with serious pull did this. This isn't the kind of paperwork error we usually see. I left the office without another word, walking fast, trying to keep my breathing steady, trying to convince myself this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself within the hour. I went to my old cargo dock next, hoping at least my work contract remained untouched. The dock supervisor, a heavy-set man named Oliver Hart, wouldn't even meet my eyes. Your contract's been bought out, he said quietly. Full transfer. I got the notice this morning. I'm sorry, Claire. There's nothing I can do. Bought out by who? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I already knew. I stood there on the dock, watching ships come and go, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the station's temperature controls. Damon Voss hadn't threatened me. He hadn't sent enforcers to intimidate me into changing my answer. He had done something far quieter, far more unsettling. He had reached into the systems that governed my entire existence on this station, my home, my job, my legal standing, and rewritten them overnight, as easily as flipping a switch. I thought about the stories I'd heard about him, the way people simply vanished from the registry when they crossed him. I had assumed those stories meant something violent had happened to them. Standing there, staring at the empty space where my life used to be, I understood the truth was far worse and far more clever than that. He didn't need violence. He had access to the very foundation of how this station recorded who existed and who didn't, and he used it like a scalpel instead of a hammer. I should have been terrified. Some part of me was, but underneath the fear, something else was building, something sharper and colder that felt almost like clarity. He thought rewriting my life would break me, would send me running back to that lounge begging to sign whatever contract made this stop. He thought I would fold the way everyone else on this station folded when the Combine's machinery turned against them. He didn't know me at all. I had spent 6 years learning every regulation, every shipping code, every strange bureaucratic quirk of the Vasari administrative systems, not because I found it interesting, but because it was the only way a human without money or connections could survive out here without getting crushed by paperwork designed by beings who barely understood how fragile human lives actually were. If Damon Voss wanted to fight this battle through systems and signatures, he had picked the wrong human to underestimate. I walked back toward the residential office with my head high, already thinking through every regulation I had ever read about unlawful transfer of civilian assets under Combine jurisdiction. Somewhere in that mountain of alien bureaucracy, there had to be a loophole. There always was. I just had to find it before he found a way to close it. On my way there, I passed the observation window near the central concourse, the one place on Kestrel 9 where you could actually see the stars instead of another gray corridor wall. I stopped for a moment, not because I wanted to admire the view, but because I needed a second to think, without anyone watching my face for a reaction. 6 years ago, when I first arrived on this station, I had nothing but a work visa and a stubborn belief that hard work would eventually earn me something solid to stand on. I had watched other humans get chewed up by the Combine's endless regulations, evicted, reassigned, quietly erased from the system because they didn't understand the fine print buried inside contracts written in a language designed to confuse rather than inform. I promised myself I would never be one of those people. I read everything. Every housing statute, every labor code, every strange clause buried in the Combine's civil registry. Not because anyone asked me to, but because ignorance out here was the fastest way to disappear. Now that knowledge felt like the only weapon I had left. I thought about Damon Voss's face when I said no. He hadn't looked angry. He had looked almost curious, like a man rearranging pieces on a board he already knew he controlled. That unsettled me more than any threat could have. Threats meant emotion. Emotion meant mistakes. What he had done instead was calm, procedural, and terrifyingly efficient. By the time I reached the residential office again, Nathan Pierce was helping another tenant, a young woman clutching a data pad and arguing quietly about a rent increase she clearly couldn't afford. I waited my turn, forcing myself to stay patient, even though every second felt like it mattered. "Back again," Nathan said, when it was finally my turn, not unkindly. "I pulled a few more details after you left. Whoever did this moved fast. Faster than I've ever seen a housing transfer processed, honestly." "Is there a way to appeal it?" "There's always a way to appeal something technically," he said, lowering his voice. "Whether it goes anywhere is a different question. Combined housing disputes go through an arbitration board, but you need grounds. Real grounds, not just a bad feeling that something's unfair." "What counts as grounds?" He hesitated, glancing around the office, like he was deciding how much he wanted to get involved in something this far above his pay grade. "Procedural violation," he said finally. "If whoever filed this skipped a required step, even a small one, the whole transfer becomes contestable. But you'd need to prove it, and proving anything against Voss Logistics Group isn't exactly a small task for someone in your position." "I've read every housing statute on this station twice," I said. "If there's a missing step, I'll find it." Nathan studied me for a moment, something like respect flickering across his tired expression. "Then I hope you're as thorough as you sound, because whoever's behind this clearly expected you to give up by now." I left the office with a plan forming, rough and uncertain, but a plan nonetheless. I wasn't going to beg Damon Voss to reverse what he'd done. I wasn't going to run back to that lounge and sign anything just to make the fear stop. If he wanted to use the Combine's own systems as a weapon against me, then I would learn those systems better than he ever had, and I would use them right back. Walking through the station that night, past the flickering lights and the quiet hum of recyclers that never quite worked right, I felt something shift inside me. Fear was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. But underneath it, stubborn and growing, was something that felt almost like purpose. He had erased my address, my job, my place on this station's registry. What he hadn't erased, and what he clearly hadn't planned for, was 6 years of reading fine print nobody else bothered to read. That was about to become his biggest mistake. 3 days after my apartment stopped recognizing me, I found myself standing in a unit I had never chosen, holding a key card I had never requested, staring at furniture that wasn't mine but somehow fit the space perfectly. The new unit was nicer than anything I could have afforded on my own. Larger windows, better air filtration, a real bed instead of the fold-out cot I had slept on for years. That was the part that scared me most. It wasn't punishment. It was replacement. Like someone had decided my old life was a draft, and this was the final version. I set my bag down slowly, half expecting an alarm to trigger, half expecting enforcers to burst through the door and tell me there had been some mistake. Nothing happened. The silence in that apartment felt heavier than any threat. My comm chimed. A message from an unknown sender, though I already knew who it was before I opened it. "Consider this a gesture of good faith," it read. "Your new position starts tomorrow at 0800. Someone will brief you on arrival." New position, I said out loud, to no one, because saying it made it feel slightly less absurd. I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't agreed to anything. And yet here I was, standing in an apartment I never asked for, apparently employed at a job I had never interviewed for, all because I said no to a man who couldn't accept that word from anyone. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling, running through every scrap of Combine housing and labor law I had memorized over the years, searching for the thread that would unravel this entire situation. Somewhere in that tangle of regulations, there had to be something Damon Voss missed. People who move that fast usually skip steps. Skipped steps meant vulnerabilities. The next morning, I went to the address listed in the message, mostly out of curiosity, partly because ignoring it felt like walking blind into whatever came next. It was a logistics office 2 rings above where I used to work, clean and quiet, staffed by people who moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that told me this operation had been running smoothly long before I arrived. A woman introduced herself at the front desk. Grace Miller, according to her name tag, with sharp eyes that studied me a little too carefully for someone simply doing intake paperwork. "You're the new logistics coordinator," she said, not really a question. "Apparently," I said. "Mr. Voss said you'd be difficult," she said, almost amused. He said it like it was a compliment. It wasn't meant as flattery when I said no to him. Grace's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Come with me. I'll show you your station." I followed her through a series of corridors, lined with cargo manifests and shipping schedules, past workers who barely glanced up from their consoles, until we reached a small office with my name already printed on the doorplate. Claire Bennett. Like I had worked there for years, instead of walking in for the first time that morning. "This is insane," I muttered. "This is Kestrel 9, Grace said quietly. "Insane is just Tuesday around here." She left me alone in that office, and I spent the next hour simply sitting there, staring at a console full of shipping records I had no memory of being trained on, yet somehow understood perfectly, because it turned out this position used exactly the same regulatory codes I had spent years memorizing on my own time. That detail bothered me more than anything else. He hadn't just given me a job, he had given me a job that matched my exact expertise, as if he had studied me long before that day in the docking bay. At lunch, I finally worked up the nerve to ask one of the other coordinators, a quiet man named Ethan Marsh, how long this position had existed. "Officially," he said, lowering his voice, "since yesterday, they restructured half this department overnight to make room for it." "For me?" He nodded slowly. "People don't usually say no to Voss and end up with better housing and a promotion, Claire. Whatever you did, it either terrified him or impressed him, maybe both." I didn't have an answer for that, because honestly, I didn't know which possibility frightened me more. Over the following days, I settled into an uneasy rhythm. I did the work, because refusing to work felt like giving him exactly the reaction he wanted, some dramatic collapse he could point to and say, "See, I told you she'd break eventually." Instead, I showed up every morning, did my job well, and spent every spare minute studying every regulation connected to my new position, my old position, my apartment transfer, anything that might explain how he had moved so quickly and so cleanly through systems that were supposed to require weeks of approval. What I found didn't make sense at first. The transfer orders referenced an obscure clause buried deep in Combine Civil Code, something about emergency reallocation for essential personnel during infrastructure adjustments. I had never even heard of that clause before, despite years of reading everything I could get my hands on. That meant either it was new, or it was rarely used because almost nobody qualified for it. I brought my findings to Grace one evening, mostly because she was the only person in that office who seemed to trust me enough to speak honestly. "Emergency reallocation," she repeated, reading over my notes. "That's old Combine law, from before humans even had a formal presence in this sector. It lets Combine-affiliated organizations reassign personnel and housing during declared infrastructure emergencies. No individual consent required." "There's no infrastructure emergency happening on this station." "There is now," Grace said, tapping through a public bulletin on her datapad. "Filed 2 days ago. Structural inspection required across several residential and logistics sectors due to power grid instability." I stared at the bulletin, at the official Combine seal stamped across the top, at the timestamp that lined up perfectly with the morning my apartment stopped recognizing my access chip. "He created an emergency," I said slowly, "just to make the reallocation clause apply to me specifically." "Looks that way. That has to be illegal. You can't fabricate an infrastructure emergency just to justify seizing someone's housing." Grace gave me a look that was somewhere between sympathy and warning. "Proving it was fabricated is a different problem than knowing it was fabricated, Claire. He didn't break the law. He found a technicality wide enough to drive a transport ship through, and he used it before anyone thought to check whether the emergency was real." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something cold and clear settle over the panic I had been carrying since that first morning. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't hurt me. He had done something far more calculated. He had manufactured a legal justification, buried deep enough in obscure regulation that almost nobody would think to question it, and used it to rebuild my entire life exactly the way he wanted, all while staying completely within the letter of Combine law. It was clever. It was also, I realized slowly, exactly the kind of move that could unravel just as completely if someone found the right thread to pull. If the emergency was fabricated, I said, then the reallocation clause never should have applied to me in the first place. Probably not, Grace agreed. But you'd need proof the emergency itself was false, not just convenient, and good luck finding an inspector willing to say a Combine bulletin was fake when Voss Logistics has contracts with half the maintenance crews on this station. I thought about that all the way back to my new apartment that night, walking slowly through corridors that no longer felt entirely unfamiliar, which bothered me almost as much as the transfer itself. I was starting to adjust to a life I never agreed to live, and some small, exhausted part of me wondered if that was exactly what he was counting on. Not fear, not force, just time, slowly wearing down my resistance until this new life simply became my life, whether I ever accepted it or not. I refused to let that happen. That night, instead of sleeping, I pulled up every public record connected to the station's power grid, cross-referencing maintenance logs against the emergency bulletin Grace had shown me. If the emergency was fabricated, there would be a gap somewhere, a moment where the official story didn't quite match the physical reality of the station's systems. Alien bureaucracy was many things, but it was rarely perfectly consistent, especially when it was constructed quickly to serve one specific purpose. Around 3 in the morning, I found it. A maintenance report filed the same day as the emergency bulletin, describing the power grid across my old residential sector as fully operational and within normal parameters, no instability detected. The report existed in a completely different database than the one Grace had pulled the bulletin from, one meant for internal engineering review rather than public announcements, which was probably why nobody had thought to check it before. 2 documents, filed the same day, directly contradicting each other. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, feeling something shift inside me that felt almost like victory, even though I knew this was only the first thread in what was probably a much larger tangle. Damon Voss had built an entire justification on top of a lie, and lies, unlike carefully worded legal technicalities, tended to leave evidence behind for anyone patient enough to look. I saved both documents, backed them up in 3 separate locations, and finally allowed myself to feel something other than fear, for the first time since this entire nightmare began. He thought rewriting my life would make me disappear quietly into whatever role he had built for me. Instead, I had just found the first crack in his foundation, and I intended to keep digging until the whole structure came down around him. The next morning, exhaustion pulled at every part of me, but I forced myself into the logistics office at the usual hour, determined not to let a single detail of my routine change. If Damon Voss was watching to see whether I would crack under the weight of everything he had done, I refused to give him the satisfaction. Ethan Marsh caught up with me near the break room, his voice low even though the corridor was mostly empty. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't, really." "Working on something?" I hesitated, weighing how much to say. Ethan had been kind since my first day, but kindness on Kestrel 9 didn't always mean trustworthy, especially in an office that answered directly to Voss Logistics Group. Still, something in his expression, tired and quietly frustrated, made me decide to take the risk. "Did you know a structural emergency was declared across the residential sectors 2 days before my apartment got reassigned?" Ethan's frown deepened. "There wasn't any emergency. I live 3 corridors over from your old unit. Nothing happened to the power grid. If anything had actually failed, we would have felt it in the shipping bay first. Cargo cooling units are the first system to show strain during any real grid instability." "That's what I thought," I said. "I found an internal maintenance report that says the same thing. Fully operational, no instability. Filed the same day as the public bulletin announcing the emergency." Ethan glanced around the corridor again, clearly uncomfortable now. "You're saying Voss fabricated an emergency just to get you reassigned?" "I'm saying the paperwork doesn't match reality, and reality usually wins eventually." He was quiet for a long moment, chewing on that thought. "You're not the only one this has happened to, you know. Not exactly the same, but close enough. There's a woman on the maintenance crew, Hannah Reyes, who got reassigned to a worse shift a few months back, under some similarly obscure clause, and a cargo handler named Marcus Doyle, who lost his housing allowance overnight, after a dispute with one of Voss's shipments. Nobody talks about it directly, because everyone's scared of ending up worse off, but it happens more than people admit. That detail struck me harder than I expected. I had assumed, foolishly maybe, that what happened to me was personal, a direct response to refusing Voss's proposal. Hearing that this kind of quiet, procedural erasure had happened to others made it feel less like an isolated act of retaliation and more like a pattern, a method he used whenever the Combine's own systems could be twisted into doing his work for him. Would they talk to me? I asked. Reyes and Doyle? Maybe, Ethan said carefully, if they trusted you weren't going to make things worse for them by asking. I just want to understand the pattern. If this has happened before, there might be more documents like the ones I found. More contradictions. Ethan studied me for a moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. You're actually trying to fight this. I don't see another option that doesn't involve giving up everything I've worked for. He nodded slowly, like he was making a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. I'll talk to them, quietly, no promises. That evening, after my shift ended, Grace found me again in my office, staring at the two contradictory documents still open on my console. You look like someone who found something bigger than one apartment transfer, she said. I think I did, I said, and told her what Ethan had shared about Hannah Reyes and Marcus Doyle. Grace's expression grew serious in a way I hadn't seen from her before. If there's a pattern, and if you can actually prove the emergency declarations were fabricated across multiple cases, that's not just a personal grievance anymore, Claire. That's evidence of systematic abuse of Combine administrative law. That's the kind of thing that gets attention from oversight bodies who don't answer to Voss logistics at all. Assuming those oversight bodies actually care about what happens to humans on a station like this. They care about precedent, Grace said. Alien law is built on precedent more than most human systems ever were. If Voss establishes a precedent where fabricated emergencies justify seizing property and reassigning labor without consent, that precedent doesn't just apply to him, it applies to every Combine-affiliated operation in this sector. Some of the more cautious enforcement bodies might actually want to shut that down before it spreads, purely to protect their own authority. I sat with that thought for a long time after Grace left, turning it over slowly. This had started as a fight over my own apartment, my own job, my own stubborn refusal to be bought. It was becoming something larger now, a thread that, if pulled hard enough and carefully enough, might unravel far more than just my situation. I thought about Damon Voss's calm, unreadable expression the night I said no to him, the way he had looked almost curious rather than angry. I wondered if he had any idea that his quiet, efficient method of control might contain the very seed of his own downfall, buried in a pattern of fabricated emergencies that other people, tired and afraid, had simply learned to endure in silence. I intended to make sure that silence didn't last much longer. The knock on my apartment door came at nearly midnight, sharp and urgent, and my heart slammed against my ribs before I even reached the entry panel. I checked the visual feed first, a habit I had picked up fast since my life started unraveling in ways I never expected. It wasn't an enforcer, it was Ethan Marsh, along with a woman I didn't recognize, and a heavy-set man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in days. I opened the door carefully. It's late. We didn't want to be seen, Ethan said quietly, stepping inside once I waved them through. This is Hannah Reyes and Marcus Doyle. Hannah looked to be in her 30s, sharp-eyed despite the exhaustion written across her face. Marcus was older, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calloused hands that came from years of physical labor in cargo bays. Neither of them looked comfortable being there. Ethan said you found something, Hannah said, her voice low, about the emergency declarations. I found a contradiction, I said, gesturing for them to sit. A public bulletin claiming grid instability, and an internal report from the same day saying everything was fine, filed against my old residential sector, right before my apartment got reassigned. Marcus exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his face. Same thing happened to me. Different reason listed, something about cargo bay restructuring, needing my housing allowance redirected to essential logistics staff. I never saw any restructuring happen, just lost my allowance overnight, and got pushed into a bunk assignment with 3 other men. When was this? I asked. 4 months back, Marcus said. Around the same time, I refused to falsify a shipment manifest for one of Voss's transport runs. I wouldn't sign off on cargo weights that didn't match what was actually loaded. 2 days later, my housing allowance was gone. Hannah nodded slowly, arms crossed tight against her chest. Mine's similar. I flagged safety violations on one of the maintenance contracts tied to Voss Logistics. Faulty pressure seals on cargo containers, the kind of thing that could kill someone if it failed during transport. A week after I filed the report, I got reassigned to the worst shift rotation on this station, under some clause about operational necessity during a staffing shortage. There was no staffing shortage. I checked the records myself. I sat back, feeling the shape of something much larger settling into focus. This wasn't just about my refusal of his proposal. This was a pattern, a method Voss used whenever someone became inconvenient, whether they crossed him directly or simply refused to look away from something he wanted hidden. He's using Combine administrative law like a weapon, I said slowly, manufacturing justifications, however thin, to reshape people's lives whenever they become a problem for him. And because each case looks isolated, nobody connects them. Nobody wants to connect them, Marcus said bitterly. Connecting them means admitting you're a target too, and most people around here would rather stay quiet and keep what little they have left. I understand that fear, I said. But quiet hasn't protected any of us so far. It just made it easier for him to keep doing this without anyone building a case against him. Hannah studied me carefully. What exactly are you proposing? I want to gather every instance of this pattern I can find. Every fabricated emergency, every falsified staffing shortage, every excuse used to justify taking something from someone who became inconvenient. If I can show this isn't isolated, that it's systematic, then it stops being a personal grievance and becomes evidence of abuse against Combine law itself. And you think that matters to the Combine? Marcus asked skeptically. They barely notice humans exist most days, except when it's convenient to extract labor from us. They notice precedent, I said, echoing what Grace had told me. Alien law runs on precedent more than anything else. If Voss establishes a working method for manufacturing justifications to seize property and reassign labor without consent, and it spreads beyond his operation, some enforcement body eventually has to deal with the fallout. I'm betting there are officials within the Combine who would rather shut this down quietly than let it become a bigger problem later. The room went quiet for a long moment. Ethan finally broke the silence. It's a big bet. It's the only one I've got, I said. I'm not asking any of you to do anything dangerous. I just need to know if there are others. Documents, records, anything that shows the pattern clearly enough that it can't be dismissed as coincidence. Marcus and Hannah exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. There's a man on the docking crew, Hannah said slowly. Oliver Hart, runs dock scheduling. He's seen more contract transfers and reassignments than almost anyone, because he processes half the paperwork that comes through this station's labor authority. If anyone has records going back further than what any of us can access individually, it's him. I recognized the name immediately. He was my old dock supervisor. He told me my contract had been bought out, but he wouldn't say who by, even though I already knew. He's careful, Hannah said, but he's not happy about what's been happening either. I think if he understood what you were actually trying to do, he might help. I felt something steady settle into my chest, the first real sense that this fight might actually be winnable, rather than just a stubborn refusal to accept defeat gracefully. Then I need to talk to him, I said, carefully, without anyone noticing. Over the following week, I moved through my days with a strange kind of doubled focus, performing my job at the logistics office competently enough that nobody watching from Voss Logistics would suspect anything unusual, while spending every spare hour building a case that grew more damning with every new piece of evidence I uncovered. Oliver Hart, once he understood what I was trying to prove, turned out to be far more useful than I expected. He had kept his own private records for years, a habit born from watching too many contract disputes get buried, or conveniently lost, whenever they became inconvenient for whoever held power at the time. He shared copies of contract transfers going back nearly 2 years, each one connected to some obscure Combine regulation invoked at exactly the right moment to justify reassigning a human worker who had become a problem for Voss Logistics Group. 14 cases, 14 instances of fabricated emergencies, falsified staffing shortages, and manufactured operational necessities, each one timed suspiciously close to some conflict between the affected worker and Voss's operation. Refused shipments, flagged safety violations, unpaid overtime disputes, and now, my own refusal of his billion credit proposal, all handled through the same quiet, procedural method of erasing inconvenient people from the systems that governed their lives. I spent 3 sleepless nights organizing everything into a clear, undeniable timeline, cross-referencing every fabricated bulletin against the internal reports that contradicted them, building a case so tightly constructed that even someone determined to dismiss it would struggle to find a genuine flaw in the logic. Grace helped where she could, quietly pulling records from the logistics office database during hours when nobody else was watching, careful never to leave a trace that could be traced back to either of us. Ethan kept his ear to the ground around the office, warning me whenever Voss's enforcers seemed to be paying unusual attention to my activities. "You need to be careful," Grace warned me one evening, after helping me cross-reference the final piece of evidence I needed. "If Voss realizes what you're building before you're ready to present it, he won't hesitate to bury it, and possibly bury you along with it." "I know," I said. "That's why I need to move fast, and why I need somewhere safe to present this once I'm ready." "Combine Arbitration Board," Grace said. "It's the only body with actual authority to review administrative abuse claims against organizations like Voss Logistics. But getting an audience with them isn't easy. They don't take requests from random cargo workers, no matter how solid the evidence looks." "Then I need someone with enough standing to force the issue." Grace was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing something in her mind. "There's an obscure statute, buried in the same section of Combine Civil Code Voss used against you. Section on unlawful identity and asset transfer. It allows any affected party to request a formal audience directly with the responsible authority, provided they can demonstrate a documented pattern of abuse rather than a single isolated incident." "You're saying I qualify." "I'm saying you might, if this timeline holds up to scrutiny. It's obscure enough that almost nobody invokes it, which means almost nobody has tested how the arbitration board actually responds when a human cites it. You'd be the first." I felt a slow, steady kind of resolve settle over the fear that had been living in my chest since that first morning my apartment stopped recognizing me. Being first meant uncertainty. It also meant Voss had no precedent to lean on either. No established playbook for how to counter a human who understood his own systems well enough to turn them back against him. "Then I'll be the first," I said. Hannah, who had stayed quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "If you do this, and it works, it doesn't just help you, it sets a precedent that protects the rest of us too." "That's exactly why I'm doing it," I said. This was never just about my apartment, or my job, or even Voss's proposal. It's about every person on this station who's had their life quietly rewritten because they became inconvenient to someone with enough power to twist the rules in his favor. Marcus, standing near the doorway with his arms crossed, finally allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Never thought I'd see the day someone actually tried to beat Voss at his own game, using nothing but paperwork." "Paperwork built his empire," I said. "It's only fair paperwork brings it down." That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the completed timeline glowing on my console. 14 documented cases of fabricated justification, stretching back nearly 2 years. Each one a quiet act of erasure disguised as bureaucratic necessity. I thought about the fear that had gripped me the morning I first found my apartment locked against me. The cold certainty that Damon Voss could simply rewrite my existence with a signature and a stamp. That fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had changed shape, transformed into something sharper and more useful. I wasn't running from what he had done anymore. I was building the exact tool needed to unmake it, one contradiction at a time, one fabricated emergency exposed after another, until the entire foundation of his careful, procedural control stood exposed for exactly what it was. I sent a formal request that night, invoking the obscure statute Grace had found, requesting a direct audience with the Combine Arbitration Board to present documented evidence of systematic administrative abuse under Section on unlawful identity and asset transfer. Then I waited, knowing that somewhere across the station, Damon Voss was about to discover that the woman whose entire life he rewrote overnight had spent every single night since then learning exactly how to rewrite it back. 2 days passed with no response from the arbitration board, and the silence gnawed at me more than I wanted to admit. I kept working my shifts at the logistics office, kept my expression neutral whenever Grace passed near my desk, kept waiting for some sign that my request had actually been received, rather than quietly buried the moment someone at the board recognized Voss Logistics attached to the case. On the third day, Nathan Pierce found me during my lunch break, slipping into the seat across from me in the station's small commissary, with a nervous energy I hadn't seen from him before. "You filed something with the arbitration board," he said quietly. "Word travels fast in the housing office, even about requests that aren't supposed to be public yet." "I did," I said carefully, not entirely sure how much I could trust him with, even after he had helped me before. "They flagged it internally," Nathan said. "That obscure statute you used hasn't been invoked in years, maybe longer. It triggered some kind of automatic review process nobody expected, because the system isn't built to handle requests like this smoothly. A few people in my office are already talking about it, wondering who would be reckless enough to go up against Voss Logistics directly." "Is that good or bad?" "Both, probably," Nathan admitted. "Good, because it means your request can't just quietly disappear without someone noticing the flag. Bad, because it also means word is spreading, and eventually it's going to reach people connected to Voss, if it hasn't already." I felt my stomach tighten at that. I had hoped to build my case fully before Voss even realized what I was doing, giving myself time to present everything cleanly, without interference. That window was clearly closing faster than I wanted. That evening, walking back toward my apartment, I noticed a figure waiting near the corridor junction close to my building. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture, the stillness of someone completely at ease, in a place where most people rushed nervously from point to point. Damon Voss. My pulse spiked, but I forced myself to keep walking at a steady pace rather than freezing or turning back. "Claire," he said, as I approached, his voice calm, almost pleasant, in a way that unsettled me more than open hostility would have. "I hear you've been busy." "Word travels fast," I said, echoing Nathan's words without meaning to. "It does, when someone files a request that hasn't been used in longer than either of us have been alive." He studied me carefully, the same curious expression from that first night in the lounge. "You could have simply reconsidered my proposal. It would have been far less complicated." "I told you no, because I meant it. Nothing about complications changes that answer." "No," he agreed slowly. "It seems it doesn't. I have to admit, Claire, this isn't the response I expected. Most people, once their lives get restructured the way yours has, tend to fold rather quickly. You've done the opposite. Because what you did wasn't fair, and fairness matters to me more than convenience." Something shifted behind his eyes, something I couldn't quite name, not anger. Something closer to genuine curiosity, like he was recalculating an equation he thought he had already solved. "You understand," he said, "that even if your request reaches the arbitration board, even if it somehow succeeds, it changes very little in practical terms. My operations continue. My standing within the Combine remains largely intact. You'll have made a point, nothing more." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it stops you from doing this to the next person who refuses you, or the next person who reports a safety violation you'd rather keep quiet, or the next person whose life becomes inconvenient enough for you to erase with a signature." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away, though I refused to give him that satisfaction. "You've been talking to people," he said finally. "Reyes Doyle, Hart probably, given his access to old contracts." I said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny anything that might expose them to retaliation. "I'm not going to pretend that doesn't concern me," he continued. "Not because I fear some obscure statute succeeding where nothing else has. Because it means you understand my methods well enough to potentially disrupt them, and that's not a quality I encounter often in the people I do business with." "Then maybe you've been doing business with the wrong kind of people." Something almost like a smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps," he said. Good luck with your arbitration request, Claire. I mean that sincerely. Strange as it might sound coming from me. Whatever happens next, I suspect it's going to be interesting. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in that corridor with my heart pounding and my mind racing through everything that exchange might mean. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't ordered his enforcers to intervene. If anything, he seemed almost intrigued by the possibility that I might actually succeed, which unsettled me far more than open hostility ever could have. I went home that night and immediately contacted Grace, relaying the entire conversation as precisely as I could remember it. "He's not panicking," Grace said slowly, after I finished, "which either means he's confident the arbitration board will dismiss your request without serious consideration, or he's already planning some way to counter it that we haven't anticipated yet." "Or both," I said. "Or both," she agreed grimly. "Either way, we need to move faster than we planned. If there's any chance he's preparing a countermeasure, we can't afford to give him time to build it." The following morning, an official notice finally arrived through the station's secure channel, confirming that my request had been accepted for review, with a formal audience scheduled before the Combine Arbitration Board within the week. I read that notice 3 times, making sure I hadn't misunderstood something in the dense, formal language typical of Combine administrative communication. It was real. After everything, after the fear and the sleepless nights and the quiet, careful work of building a case strong enough to survive scrutiny, I finally had a date, a real chance to stand in front of an authority with the power to undo what Damon Voss had done, not just to me, but to everyone whose life he had quietly rewritten whenever they became inconvenient. I called Hannah, Marcus, and Ethan that same evening, sharing the news, watching relief and cautious hope flicker across their faces through the comm screen. "This is really happening," Marcus said, sounding almost stunned. "It's really happening," I confirmed. "Now we need to make sure everything we've built is airtight, because we won't get a second chance if this fails." Hannah nodded slowly, her expression steady, despite the exhaustion still visible beneath her eyes. "Then let's make sure it doesn't fail." For the remainder of that week, we worked tirelessly, refining the timeline, double-checking every document, preparing testimony that would hold up under whatever scrutiny the arbitration board chose to apply. I barely slept, running on determination more than actual rest, but for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the fear that had haunted me every waking moment had been replaced by something steadier. Not certainty. I wasn't foolish enough to believe certainty existed in a fight against someone as careful and calculating as Damon Voss. But purpose. Something solid enough to stand on, no matter what happened next. The arbitration chamber was colder than any room I had ever stood in, and not just because of the temperature. I stood at a raised podium, my hands steady, despite everything screaming inside me to run, facing a curved bench where 3 Vasari officials sat, their expressions unreadable behind features that never quite translated into anything human eyes could easily interpret. Behind me, Grace, Hannah, Marcus, Ethan, and Oliver sat in a small gallery reserved for witnesses, close enough that I could feel their support even without turning to look at them. Across the chamber, Damon Voss sat alone at a separate podium, dressed sharply, his expression composed into something almost bored, as if this entire proceeding were an inconvenience, rather than a genuine threat to everything he had built. The lead arbitrator, a Vasari official whose translated name registered simply as Overseer Thessaly, addressed the chamber in a voice that carried without needing to be raised. "This audience has been called under section on unlawful identity and asset transfer, requested by the human petitioner Claire Bennett, alleging systematic administrative abuse by Voss Logistics Group. Petitioner, you may present your case." I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and forced my voice to remain steady. 3 weeks ago, I declined a personal proposal from Damon Voss. Within 24 hours, my residential unit was reassigned, my labor contract was transferred, and my legal standing on Kestrel 9 was rewritten entirely, all under an emergency reallocation clause tied to an infrastructure emergency that never actually existed. I presented the first document, the public bulletin claiming grid instability across my former residential sector, followed immediately by the internal maintenance report contradicting it entirely, filed the same day, describing the same systems as fully operational. This is not an isolated incident, I continued. I have documented 14 separate cases over the past 2 years, each following an identical pattern. A worker becomes inconvenient to Voss Logistics Group, whether through refusing an improper request, reporting a safety violation, or declining a personal proposal, and within days, an obscure emergency or staffing shortage is declared, justifying the reassignment of that individual's housing, labor contract, or both, without their consent. I walked the arbitration board through each case methodically, presenting Marcus Doyle's falsified cargo bay restructuring, Hannah Reyes's fabricated staffing shortage following her safety report, and 10 additional cases Oliver Hart had quietly preserved from years of processing labor contracts that others had long forgotten or been too afraid to question. Damon Voss listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable throughout my entire presentation, though I caught the faintest tightening around his eyes as I laid out case after case, timeline after timeline, each one built from documents that contradicted each other in exactly the same suspicious pattern. When I finished, Overseer Thessaly turned toward Voss's podium. "Respondent, you may address these allegations." Voss rose slowly, unhurried, exactly as composed as he had been throughout the entire proceeding. "I appreciate the petitioner's thoroughness," he said, genuinely. "It's rare to encounter this level of preparation from someone in her position. However, I would remind the board that every action taken by Voss Logistics Group was executed strictly within the boundaries of existing Combine Civil Code. Emergency reallocation clauses exist precisely because infrastructure concerns require rapid response, faster than standard bureaucratic processes typically allow. The infrastructure concerns didn't exist, I said, unable to stop myself. Overseer Thessaly's attention shifted toward me briefly. "Petitioner, you will have opportunity to respond. Allow the respondent to finish." Voss continued smoothly, as though my interruption hadn't happened at all. "The petitioner has presented documents suggesting contradiction, but contradiction alone does not prove fabrication. Maintenance reports can be incomplete. Bulletins can reflect precautionary measures rather than confirmed failures. I would suggest the board consider whether genuine bureaucratic inconsistency, common across any large administrative system, is being mischaracterized here as deliberate malfeasance." It was a clever argument, calm and reasonable sounding, exactly the kind of thing that might work on officials predisposed to dismiss a human petitioner's claims as exaggerated or emotionally driven, rather than factually grounded. I felt a flicker of panic, watching Overseer Thessaly's expression remain frustratingly neutral, giving no indication whether Voss's argument was landing or not. Then Oliver Hart rose slightly from the gallery, catching my eye. I remembered, suddenly, the additional evidence he had shared with me only 2 days earlier, evidence I had almost forgotten to include, given how much material we had assembled. "If the board will permit," I said, "I have one additional document that directly addresses the respondent's argument regarding bureaucratic inconsistency." Overseer Thessaly gestured for me to continue. I presented the final piece of evidence, a procurement record showing that Voss Logistics Group had purchased and filed the emergency bulletin template itself, through a private administrative contractor, 2 full days before the alleged infrastructure emergency was ever declared. The chamber went quiet. "This is not bureaucratic inconsistency," I said, my voice growing steadier with every word. "This is a purchase order for a fabricated emergency declaration, filed before the emergency it describes supposedly occurred. The respondent didn't misinterpret an existing bureaucratic process. He manufactured one, in advance, specifically to justify seizing my housing and labor contract after I declined his personal proposal." For the first time throughout the entire proceeding, Damon Voss's composed expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see it. "That procurement record," he said, his voice tightening for the first time, "was obtained through channels that require verification before the board treats it as credible evidence. The procurement record is a matter of public administrative record," Oliver Hart said, rising fully now from the gallery. "I processed the filing myself as part of my duties overseeing dock and labor contract documentation. I can verify its authenticity directly, under oath, if the board requires it." Overseer Thessaly's attention shifted between Voss and Oliver, something calculating passing behind those alien features. The board will require that verification, Thessaly said finally. Additionally, given the number of cases presented and the apparent pattern connecting them, this board finds sufficient grounds to expand this inquiry beyond the petitioner's individual case. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he maintained his composure otherwise. With respect, he said, expanding this inquiry based on a single contested procurement record seems premature. The board disagrees, Thessaly said simply. 14 documented cases, following an identical pattern, connected now by direct evidence of advanced fabrication in at least one instance, constitutes sufficient grounds for formal investigation into Voss Logistics Group's administrative practices across the entirety of its operations on Kestrel 9. I felt something loosen in my chest, relief mixing with disbelief that this moment, the one I had worked toward through sleepless nights and careful documentation, was actually unfolding exactly the way I had hoped it might. Voss remained silent for a long moment, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he had walked into this chamber with. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier composure, replaced by something more careful, more measured. If the board is expanding this inquiry, he said, I would request the opportunity to address the underlying allegations directly, rather than allowing this proceeding to become a broader indictment based on incomplete information. You will have that opportunity, Thessaly said. During the formal investigation, which this board is authorizing effective immediately. In the meantime, given the specific evidence presented regarding the petitioner's individual case, this board finds the emergency reallocation applied to Claire Bennett's residential unit and labor contract to be improperly justified, and orders immediate reversal of both transfers. The words landed on me like a physical weightlifting, though I forced myself to remain composed rather than letting the relief show too openly in front of Voss. Additionally, Thessaly continued, given the pattern established across the 14 presented cases, this board orders a full audit of all labor and housing reassignments processed by Voss Logistics Group over the past 3 years, to determine the full scope of any systematic abuse. Voss said nothing further, standing rigid at his podium, his earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by something colder and far more calculating. As the proceeding concluded and the chamber began to empty, I turned to find Grace, Hannah, Marcus, Ethan, and Oliver, all watching me, with expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet triumph. You actually did it, Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper, like she was afraid saying it too loudly might undo everything that had just happened. We did it, I corrected. None of this works without all of you. Before I could say anything else, Damon Voss approached, flanked by no enforcers this time, walking alone across the emptying chamber floor. Congratulations, he said, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the calm confidence that had defined every previous interaction between us. I underestimated you. Thoroughly, apparently. You underestimated a lot of people, I said, gesturing slightly toward Hannah, Marcus, and Ethan behind me. Not just me. Something flickered across his face, and for the first time since that very first night in his private lounge, he looked genuinely uncertain about what came next. This audit, he said slowly, will likely uncover considerably more than 14 cases. Probably, I agreed. That's the point. He studied me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, something almost like respect settled into his expression. You could have simply accepted my proposal and avoided all of this. I could have, I said, but I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I let fear decide something. Principle should have decided instead. I'm not willing to live that way. He didn't respond to that, and after a long moment, he simply turned and walked away, his usual composed stride noticeably absent, replaced by something heavier, something that looked, for the very first time since I had met him, uncertain about what the future actually held. I watched him go, feeling the full weight of everything that had just happened settle slowly over me, relief and exhaustion, and something that felt dangerously close to hope, all tangled together into a single overwhelming moment. The fight wasn't fully over. An audit still loomed ahead, uncertain in its final outcome, and Damon Voss remained a powerful figure within the Combine's administrative structure, regardless of what this single proceeding had accomplished. But for the first time since my apartment door failed to recognize me, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks. I felt like I had already won something that mattered, regardless of whatever came next. Outside the arbitration chamber, the corridor felt different somehow, brighter, though I knew the lighting hadn't changed at all. Grace fell into step beside me, her usual guarded composure finally cracking into something like a genuine smile. "I've worked in that logistics office for 3 years," she said. "I've never once seen anyone walk into that chamber against a Combine-affiliated organization and walk out with an order in their favor. Not once. I almost didn't include the procurement record," I admitted. "It was buried so deep in the documents Oliver gave me, I nearly missed it entirely." "Almost didn't matters a lot less than did," Marcus said, clapping a heavy hand briefly on my shoulder. "You found it when it counted." Ethan looked lighter than I had seen him since the day he first warned me about Voss's reach across the station's administrative systems. "The audit changes everything," he said. "Once investigators start pulling every housing and labor reassignment from the past 3 years, there's no controlling how far that goes. Voss won't be able to quietly bury cases the way he has been." "Assuming the audit is conducted fairly," Hannah said, more cautious than the others. "Combined oversight bodies aren't exactly known for moving quickly, or for prioritizing human grievances over administrative convenience." "Maybe not," I said. "But Thessaly ordered it publicly, in front of witnesses, with a formal record now attached to the proceeding. That makes it much harder to quietly abandon later, even if someone within the Combine wanted to." Oliver, walking slightly behind the rest of us, finally spoke up. "I need to be careful over the next few weeks. Once word spreads that I verified that procurement record under oath, my position becomes considerably more exposed." "You won't be exposed alone," I said, turning to face him fully. "If Voss tries anything against you now, after everything just happened in that chamber, it only strengthens the case against him further. He knows that. I don't think he's foolish enough to retaliate this openly, not with an active audit hanging over his operation." Oliver didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded slowly, accepting the reasoning, even if the underlying fear hadn't fully faded. We walked together toward the residential ring, the group slowly splitting off toward their respective quarters, until it was just Grace and me remaining, walking in comfortable silence for a while before she finally spoke again. "What happens now, for you specifically?" she asked. "Your apartment and labor contract get reversed, technically restoring things to how they were before Voss interfered, but you can't exactly go back to pretending none of this happened." "No," I agreed. "I can't, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. I spent 6 years quietly surviving on this station, keeping my head down, avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, because it felt too dangerous to challenge someone as powerful as Voss directly. And now? Now I know what's possible, if people stop assuming these systems are too complicated, or too rigged against us to actually challenge. 14 cases became one formal audit tonight. I want to see what happens when that audit actually runs its course." Grace studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful behind her expression. "You're not finished with this, are you? Even after tonight?" "I don't think I am," I admitted. "Not until I know this can't quietly happen to someone else, the same way it happened to me." We reached the junction where our paths diverged, and Grace paused before continuing on toward her own quarters. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you said no to him that first night. Whatever happens with the audit, whatever Voss tries next, you already proved something important tonight. Systems built to control people can be turned back against the people who built them, if someone's patient enough and stubborn enough to actually try." I thought about that long after she left, walking the rest of the way back to my restored apartment alone, the weight of the day settling slowly into something that felt less like exhaustion and more like quiet, steady resolve. The fight wasn't over. Voss remained powerful, and the audit's outcome remained uncertain. But for the first time since my apartment door failed to recognize me weeks earlier, I understood clearly that fear no longer controlled what happened next. I did. 6 weeks after the arbitration board ordered the audit, my apartment door recognized my access chip on the very first try, and I stood in the corridor for a long moment, feeling that small, ordinary victory settle over me, like something far bigger than it should have been. The audit had moved faster and reached further than anyone expected. Overseer Thessaly, it turned out, had little patience for administrative abuse that threatened the credibility of Combine oversight itself, and once investigators began pulling records, the pattern I had uncovered expanded well beyond the 14 cases I originally presented. 22 additional instances surfaced within the first month alone, each one following the same method: fabricated emergencies, manufactured staffing shortages, obscure clauses invoked at exactly the right moment to erase someone who had become inconvenient to Voss Logistics Group. I hadn't seen Damon Voss since that night in the arbitration chamber, though reports filtered through the station regularly, second-hand accounts of enforcers being questioned, contracts being frozen pending review, and Voss himself appearing less and less at the logistics office where I still worked every day. Grace found me at my console one afternoon, holding a data pad with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Formal findings just got released," she said, sliding into the seat across from my desk. "You should see this before it goes public station-wide." I took the pad from her, scanning through the dense administrative language until the relevant section came into focus. The Combine Arbitration Board had formally sanctioned Voss Logistics Group, stripping the organization of its emergency reallocation privileges entirely, imposing significant financial penalties, and placing the entire operation under continued oversight for a minimum of 2 years. "They didn't shut him down completely," I said, reading further. "No," Grace agreed. "Voss Logistics still exists, still operates shipping routes through this sector. But he's lost the exact tool he used to control people, the way he controlled you, and everyone else in those 36 cases combined. Without emergency reallocation privileges, he can't simply manufacture justifications to seize housing or labor contracts anymore. Any future reassignment now requires actual documented consent, verified through an independent review process." I sat back, letting that settle fully. It wasn't the dramatic downfall some part of me had quietly hoped for, watching Voss lose everything overnight the same way he had once tried to erase my entire existence. But it was something real, something structural, a change that protected not just me, but everyone who might otherwise have faced the same quiet, procedural erasure in the future. "What about the 36 people affected?" I asked. "Full restitution," Grace said. "Housing restored where possible, labor contracts reinstated, financial compensation for anyone whose situation couldn't be fully reversed. Hannah's getting her old shift back, plus compensation for the months she spent on that terrible rotation. Marcus is getting his housing allowance restored retroactively." I felt something loosen further in my chest, relief mixing with a satisfaction that went deeper than I expected. This had never really been about winning against Voss personally. It had been about proving that the systems built to control people on this station weren't as absolute as everyone assumed, that patience and careful attention to detail could unravel even the most carefully constructed abuse of power. Later that evening, walking home through corridors that finally felt entirely mine again, I found Damon Voss waiting near the residential junction, alone, without enforcers, dressed more plainly than I had ever seen him. I stopped, uncertain what to expect after everything that had happened between us. "I read the findings," he said, before I could speak. "I imagine you have too." "I have." He was quiet for a moment, studying the corridor rather than me directly, something unusually subdued in his posture. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that none of what happened was ever truly personal, in the way you probably assumed. I didn't rewrite your life because I hated you, or even because your refusal wounded my pride, though I imagine that's difficult to believe given everything." "Then why?" "Because it worked," he said simply. "Every time before, people became inconvenient. I removed the inconvenience through channels the Combine itself provided, and nobody ever pushed back hard enough to matter. You were supposed to fold the same way everyone else did. I'm not everyone else." "No," he agreed, something almost rueful in his expression now. "You're clearly not. I've spent considerable time these past few weeks trying to understand exactly what I missed about you, why 6 years of quiet compliance from every other human worker on this station somehow produced the one person capable of dismantling a system I'd relied on for years." I thought about that question honestly, weighing my answer carefully before speaking. "I never had power the way you understand it," I said. "No money, no connections, Nothing that could protect me the traditional way. The only thing I ever had was knowledge, understanding the systems well enough that nobody could quietly erase me without leaving evidence behind. You built your entire operation assuming humans would never bother learning the fine print buried in alien bureaucracy. That assumption was your real mistake, not underestimating me specifically. He absorbed that slowly, something shifting behind his expression that looked almost like genuine reflection rather than calculation for once. The audit isn't finished, he said. There's still considerable scrutiny ahead, restrictions I'll be operating under for years, financial penalties that will take considerable time to recover from. I won't pretend this hasn't cost me significantly. You could have simply accepted my answer that first night, I said. None of this had to happen. I'm aware, he said quietly. Believe it or not, that realization has occupied a considerable amount of my thinking these past several weeks. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us strange, neither hostile nor entirely comfortable, something new that neither of us fully understood yet. What happens to Voss Logistics now? I asked, curious despite everything. We adapt, he said. Legitimate contracts, proper labor agreements, actual consent required for any reassignment. It's considerably more expensive to operate honestly than it was to manufacture convenient emergencies whenever someone became a problem. But it's the only path forward that doesn't end with the Combine shutting the entire operation down permanently. Good, I said, meaning it more than I expected to. Maybe this forces something better out of an organization that's been quietly hurting people for years. He almost smiled at that, something tired and genuine flickering briefly across his expression before fading again. You're remarkably forgiving, considering everything I did to you. I'm not forgiving anything, I said. I'm simply acknowledging that forcing you to operate honestly protects more people than punishing you further ever would. Those aren't the same thing. He nodded slowly, accepting that distinction without argument. For what it's worth, Claire, I respect what you accomplished here, more than I think you realize. Most people I've encountered in positions of powerlessness eventually convince themselves that fighting back isn't worth the risk. You proved that assumption wrong, thoroughly and permanently, in a way that's going to outlast whatever happens to my operation specifically. That was always the point, I said, not just fixing what happened to me, but making sure it couldn't quietly happen to the next person the same way. He extended his hand slowly, an oddly formal gesture given everything that had happened between us. I hesitated only briefly before shaking it, a strange, quiet acknowledgement that whatever this had been, confrontation, conflict, an unlikely test of wills between someone with immense institutional power and someone with nothing but patience and stubborn knowledge, it had ended somewhere neither of us fully expected when it began. Good luck, Claire Bennett, he said, releasing my hand and stepping back. I suspect this station hasn't seen the last of what you're capable of. Good luck to you too, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. Try building something honest this time. He turned and walked away without another word, his stride steadier than I had seen it since the arbitration proceeding, though something about his posture suggested a man genuinely reconsidering the foundation his entire operation had been built upon. I watched him go, then continued toward my apartment, feeling the weight of the past 6 weeks settle into something that finally resembled peace rather than exhausted vigilance. Over the following months, Kestrel 9 slowly began to change in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when I first filed that arbitration request. Other workers, emboldened by what the audit revealed, began reporting their own grievances against various Combine-affiliated organizations across the station, no longer willing to quietly accept administrative abuse as simply the cost of surviving out here. Grace eventually left the logistics office entirely, recruited by an independent labor advocacy group, forming specifically to help workers navigate exactly the kind of obscure bureaucratic loopholes I had spent years learning on my own. Hannah returned to her old shift with a quiet confidence I hadn't seen from her before, no longer afraid that reporting safety violations might cost her everything overnight. Marcus eventually left cargo work entirely, taking a position helping other workers understand their rights under Combine labor law, using his own experience as a warning for others who might otherwise assume nothing could be done. I stayed at the logistics office, though my role gradually shifted, spending more time helping other workers identify patterns of administrative abuse than actually coordinating shipments. It turned out that 6 years of stubborn, careful study of alien bureaucracy had value far beyond simply protecting myself. It could protect an entire community of people who had spent too long assuming these systems were too complicated, too rigged, too dangerous to challenge directly. One evening, nearly a year after that first confrontation in Voss's private lounge, I stood again at the observation window overlooking the docking bays, watching ships move slowly through the black distance, exactly as they had the night everything began. I thought about the woman who had stood there that night, terrified and uncertain, having just lost her apartment and her job, to a man who thought rewriting her entire existence would break her completely. I thought about how much had changed since then, not just for me, but for dozens of other workers across this station, who no longer lived in quiet fear of becoming inconvenient to someone powerful. Damon Voss had tried to change my entire life overnight, certain that fear and helplessness would eventually force me into accepting whatever future he decided for me. Instead, I had changed something far larger than my own life. I had proven, clearly and permanently, that even the most carefully constructed systems of control contained cracks wide enough for anyone patient and stubborn enough to find them. That knowledge, more than any apartment, any job, any single victory in an arbitration chamber, was the thing I would carry with me for the rest of my time on Kestrel 9, and wherever life eventually took me beyond it. I had said no once, and that single word had changed everything. I never regretted it for a moment. The day the formal findings became public across the station, I gathered with Grace, Hannah, Marcus, Ethan, and Oliver in the same small commissary where Nathan Pierce had first warned me that word of my arbitration request was spreading faster than I wanted. It felt fitting somehow, ending up back in that same quiet corner of the station where so much of this fight had first taken shape. 36 cases, Ethan said, still sounding a little stunned, even weeks after the number had become public knowledge. I keep thinking about how close all of this came to staying buried forever, if you just accepted his proposal that first night. I think about that too, I admitted. More than I probably should. Don't, Hannah said firmly. You didn't owe him compliance just because saying no was dangerous. None of us owed silence just because speaking up felt risky. You proved that clearly enough for everyone on this station to understand now. Marcus raised his cup slightly, a small, informal gesture that felt more meaningful than any formal recognition could have. To saying no, he said, and actually meaning it. We all raised whatever we were drinking, laughing quietly at the simplicity of the toast, though underneath the laughter sat something heavier, a shared understanding of exactly how much had changed because one person refused to quietly accept what power decided for her. Nathan Pierce stopped by our table briefly on his way through the commissary, offering a small, genuine smile. Housing office has been busy processing appeals ever since the findings went public, he said. Turns out a lot of people had grievances they were too afraid to file before, thinking nothing would ever come of it. Oh, how many? I asked. More than I expected, he admitted. Enough that the office is bringing on additional staff just to handle the volume. People are starting to believe these systems might actually respond to legitimate complaints, instead of just protecting whoever already holds power. That detail struck me harder than the formal sanctions against Voss Logistics ever had. Numbers and penalties were easy to measure, easy to point to as proof of victory. But this, ordinary people finally believing their voices mattered enough to be heard, felt like something far more permanent, something that would outlast whatever happened to Voss Logistics specifically in the coming years. Over the following months, I watched that shift continue to ripple outward across Kestrel 9 in ways I hadn't fully anticipated when I first filed my arbitration request. Other Combine-affiliated organizations, apparently nervous about facing similar scrutiny, began quietly revising their own labor and housing practices, eager to avoid becoming the next case study in administrative abuse. Independent advocacy groups, including the one Grace eventually joined, grew steadily busier, helping workers navigate exactly the kind of obscure bureaucratic loopholes that had once seemed impossible for ordinary people to understand, let alone challenge successfully. I received occasional updates about Voss Logistics through station channels, mostly administrative notices confirming continued compliance with the audit's ongoing requirements. Damon Voss himself remained a distant, occasional presence, glimpsed sometimes across the docking bays, or mentioned briefly in station gossip. But the aura of untouchable authority that once surrounded him had faded considerably, replaced by something more careful, more constrained, more accountable than it had ever been before. I thought about him sometimes, not with anger exactly, but with a strange, complicated curiosity about whether the changes forced upon his operation had genuinely reshaped how he approached power, or whether he simply learned to disguise the same instincts more carefully going forward. I supposed only time would answer that question honestly, and I found I no longer needed to know the answer immediately to feel satisfied with everything that had already changed. Nearly a year after that first confrontation, Hannah invited me to a small gathering, celebrating her promotion within the maintenance department, a position she never would have qualified for under the old system that had once buried her beneath a punitive shift rotation simply for reporting a safety violation. Marcus attended as well, along with several other workers I recognized from cases uncovered during the audit, people who had once lived quietly afraid of becoming inconvenient to someone powerful, now standing together with a confidence that hadn't existed on this station before. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Marcus said, finding me near the edge of the gathering. "All of this started because you refused a proposal nobody expected you to refuse." "It feels less strange than it used to," I said honestly. "I think I've finally stopped waiting for something to go wrong, for Voss, or someone like him to find some new way to undo everything we built. Maybe that's the real victory," Marcus said. "Not just the sanctions, or the restitution, or even the audit itself, just not living afraid anymore." I thought about that for a long time after the gathering ended, walking home slowly through corridors that finally felt entirely mine, filled with people who no longer moved through their days assuming powerlessness was simply the permanent cost of survival on a station like this. Later that evening, back at the same observation window where this reflection always seemed to return me, I watched the distant lights of departing ships fade slowly into the black expanse beyond the station. I thought about the woman I had been that very first night, terrified and uncertain, having just lost everything familiar to a man who assumed rewriting her existence would break her completely. I thought about every sleepless night since then, every document painstakingly cross-referenced, every quiet act of courage from people like Hannah, Marcus, Ethan, Grace, and Oliver, each of them risking something meaningful to help build a case that eventually reshaped how an entire station understood power and accountability. Damon Voss had tried to change my entire life overnight, certain that fear alone would be enough to secure my compliance. Instead, I had changed something far larger than my own circumstances. I had proven, clearly and permanently, for myself and for everyone who came after me, that even the most carefully constructed systems of control contained cracks wide enough for anyone patient and stubborn enough to find them. That knowledge, more than any apartment, any job, any single victory inside an arbitration chamber, was the thing I would carry with me for the rest of my time on Kestrel 9, and wherever life eventually took me beyond it. I had said no once, and that single word had changed everything. I never regretted it for a moment.